He was just a retired truck driver, looking to live a peaceful life with his family, until one phone call changed everything. A mysterious job, a promise of $100,000, and the name of a powerful figure, P. Diddy. What started as a simple delivery turned into a nightmare he never imagined. What was hidden in the trailers? And how far can Diddy's power reach? Discover the dark story behind a dirty fortune and an empire of fear. But first, subscribe to the channel to receive more videos like this, and check out the gift I left for you in the pinned comments. So now, let's hear this truck driver's story. 30 years on the road, that's what marked my life. 30 long years driving trucks, facing all types of weather, roads, and situations. When I hung up the keys, I thought I was finally free. My plan was simple: enjoy retirement, spend time with my family, and for the first time in decades, live without looking in the rearview mirror. But destiny had other plans. Or maybe it was something much worse than fate. Something I could never imagine. It was a morning like any other. I was in the kitchen drinking my coffee when my phone rang. I looked at the viewfinder. It was a number I didn't recognize, but for some reason, I answered. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice greeted me. My old manager, the guy who for years dispatched me to deliveries without batting an eyelid. At first, I was surprised. We hadn't spoken in years. He got straight to the point, without mincing words or ceremonies. "I have a job for you, simple, quick, and it will change your life." I laughed. "Did you change your profession so-and-so? Have you become a dream salesman now?" But he didn't laugh. On the contrary, the seriousness in his voice was almost palpable. He explained that it was a one-off job involving just 2 trips, and that the client was willing to pay $100,000. Half before the first trip, the other half after the second. The mention of the value took me by surprise. $100,000 for 2 transports. It sounded like a scam or a prank, and my first reaction was to refuse. "I'm retired," he said. "I don't need dirty money or a headache." But he insisted. And then he mentioned the client's name, P. Diddy. I'm not one to follow celebrities or care what happens in the entertainment world, but even I knew who P. Diddy was. A big name, a successful figure. Or at least that's what they said. But my manager used his name with a strange weight, as if it said something more, something I should understand. At that moment, the name didn't mean much to me. "What does he want with me?" I asked. "Someone experienced, trustworthy, and he specifically asked for you," my manager replied, as if this was some kind of honor. But his tone didn't put me at ease. In fact, it was as if he was uncomfortable even mentioning Diddy's name. The promise of money began to infiltrate my mind. $100,000. I could pay off all my family's debts, guarantee a comfortable future for my grandchildren, do something I never had the chance to do in my life. And yet, something about that conversation made me uneasy. I could feel that it wasn't just the amount that seemed too big, it was the weight he carried with him. "Why me?" I insisted. "You must have hundreds of younger, faster, more willing drivers. I've been out of the game for years." My manager's response was short but cutting. "Because he asked you, and when Diddy asks you, you don't say no." It was the way he said it, as if it weren't a request but an order, as if refusing wasn't a real option. Still, I hesitated. Something in my intuition screamed for me to refuse, but then he gave me a veiled warning. "You want your retirement to be peaceful, right? Maybe you should accept it." Those words hit me like a bullet. They weren't just an offer. They were a warning. On the other end of the line, my manager waited silently, as if he knew I was about to give in. And I gave in. "Okay," I replied, my voice coming out shakier than I expected. "But I hope this doesn't become a problem for me." He laughed, but it wasn't a comforting laugh. "Great, I'll send you the details. Get ready for the most profitable and most important trip of your life. When I hung up, a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I knew that. But still, I started to prepare. And that's how I started down the path that would take me straight to hell and P. Diddy's domain. 2 days later, there I was, driving toward a meeting point that seemed like something out of a nightmare. The location was in the middle of nowhere, a wasteland shrouded in dense fog, surrounded by abandoned houses and dirt roads that never seemed to see traffic. The entire scene had a horror movie atmosphere, and I could barely shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. When I arrived, a truck identical to mine was already parked. Leaning against him was what I assumed was my partner for the trip. He was younger, maybe 20 or 30 years younger than me, but there was something about him that I didn't like. His gaze was cold, almost lifeless, and his posture exuded a don't-ask-questions air. He didn't just seem experienced, he looked like someone who had seen things he would rather forget. I got out of the truck and gave a brief wave. He nodded back but didn't say a word. The silence between us was uncomfortable. But before I could break it, my old manager emerged from the shadows. He held a clipboard, but his eyes, usually bright and animated, were dull, as if he too was involved in something he didn't want to do. "Well, here's how it's going to work," he began, straight to the point, without any cordiality. "First, you don't open the trailer. No way. Not a look, not a check, nothing. Second, you will have 2 escort cars the entire way, one in the front and one in the back. They are there to make sure everything goes well. Don't interact with them. Third, hand over your cell phones now." "Why cell phones?" I asked, my voice carrying the irritation and discomfort that was building in me. "The client doesn't want distractions," he replied dryly, as if that were explanation enough. But the way he avoided eye contact told me there was much more to it than that. "You're being paid more than anyone else has ever been for this kind of work. Follow the rules and you'll walk out of here rich." The young partner handed over his cell phone without hesitation, but I took my time. There was something strangely vulnerable about handing over my phone, like I was giving up my only connection to the world outside this place. Still, with a heavy sigh, I handed it over. Meanwhile, the manager passed the clipboard to me. "Sign here," he said, pointing to a line that looked more like a death sentence than a contract. Without thinking much, I signed, still trying to convince myself that it was just a job like any other. But it wasn't. When we climbed into the truck, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. The engine started with a familiar roar, but even that sound that had so often been my comfort seemed out of place. Out of place. The escort soon appeared. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows that flanked us like silent predators. As the first few kilometers ticked by, I tried to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. But my partner's silence, the absence of radio, and the deserted roads made this impossible. The only thing that kept me going was remembering what the manager said: "You guys are getting paid more than anyone else." But at that point I started to wonder, what exactly are they paid to do? The real fear started when I heard the sound, a light but persistent knocking coming from the trailer. It was rhythmic, almost human. My heart raced, and for the first time, my partner spoke without even turning to face me. "Don't think about it," he said, his voice cold as steel. But how could I not think what was back there? And more importantly, why did someone as powerful as P. Diddy need such a clandestine scheme? Fear grew like a shadow inside me, and without even knowing it, I was already being sucked into something that would change my life forever. The first kilometers were agonizing. The roar of the engine, which had previously been a comforting sound, now seemed to amplify the heavy silence that surrounded us. The convoy moved in perfect synchronization, the front SUV leading, the truck following, and the rear SUV closing the formation. It was a precise, cold, calculated dance, and more I felt like a chess piece in a game I didn't understand. The sound in the trailer started again. This time, it was more intense. It wasn't just a rhythmic pounding, but something more desperate, as if whoever or whatever was inside wanted to be heard, or perhaps freed. I looked at my partner, waiting for some reaction, but he didn't even show a sign that he was worried. His eyes were fixed on the road, his expression impenetrable. "You're hearing this, aren't you?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice was low, but loaded with tension. "Yes," he responded, short and dry, without looking at me. "This isn't ordinary cargo. It's human, isn't it?" My question came out before I could think. The idea was already growing inside me, and I needed to know. Finally, he turned around, but his expression was as hard as stone. "Do you want to live to spend that money? Then don't ask, don't think, just drive." That silenced any other attempt of mine to understand what was happening. But the knocks didn't stop. With each kilometer, they seemed more insistent, almost defiant. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was fixed on what was behind me, who or what was inside. As the train rolled along, I noticed something even more disturbing. At strategic points, we came across parked SUVs, similar to the ones that escorted us. They were there, seemingly still, but I could feel the eyes inside them. They were monitoring our every move, and worse, it seemed that with each step we advanced, the weight of the silence grew more oppressive, as if we were approaching something terrible. It was then that a different sound echoed from the trailer, a muffled scream. My heart stopped for a second and my breathing quickened. It was no longer just a suspicion, it was a certainty. There were people inside, not cargo, not objects. People. I looked at my partner again, but he didn't seem shaken at all. He already knew. He knew all along. And for a moment, I thought about stopping the truck right there in the middle of that empty road and opening the back. But before the idea could turn into action, the convoy radio crackled. A cold and direct male voice came from the SUV in front. "Keep moving. No stops, no detours. We are monitoring." The message was clear and was accompanied by a brief look from my partner. He didn't need to say anything. The threat was as explicit as the weight of the silence. I followed, but now my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and the sound of the trailer banging felt like a hammer to my conscience. A few hours later, the landscape began to change. The abandoned houses gave way to large properties, and I soon saw the final destination. A colossal mansion appeared on the horizon. It looked less like a house and more like a fortress. Massive iron gates opened automatically as we approached, and the convoy entered as if it had been expected. My heart was pounding like never before, and I knew that what came next would be the true test of my sanity. The gates closed behind us with a metallic sound that seemed final, as if we were trapped inside. The mansion was huge. It wasn't just the size, it was the presence. Every detail seemed to exude power, control, and something much darker. The walls were high, with cameras on every corner, and armed guards patrolled like robots, moving in perfect synchronization. The intense lights illuminated the impeccably maintained gardens, but instead of beauty, it only reinforced the contrast with the growing darkness within me. We stopped in front of a huge warehouse on the side of the property. It was not a simple deposit. It looked like a facility made for something much bigger and more sinister than storage. As soon as I turned off the engine, the door of my truck was suddenly opened by one of the security guards. He didn't say anything, just pointed for me to get down. My partner was already outside, leaning against the truck, with the same expression of indifference. The escort SUVs stopped behind us, and men dressed in black with sunglasses got out of them. Even in that dim light, they didn't even look at us. They were there for another reason. And then finally, I saw it. The trailer doors opened, and the scene that followed will be etched in my memory forever. From inside the trailer, metal boxes began to be unloaded. They were big, heavy, but in each of them there were small holes, like vents. And coming out of those holes, I heard the sound that confirmed my worst fears: sobs, muffled cries, and faint moans of despair. Those boxes didn't carry goods, they carried people. I stepped forward instinctively. I wanted to do something, say something, but before I could, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was one of the security guards who just shook his head in a clear gesture. "Don't get involved." I returned to my seat, motionless, as I watched the scene unfold. The boxes were carried into the warehouse with frightening precision. The security guards didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. It was as if this was just another night at work for them. When the last box was unloaded, the warehouse gate closed with a loud click. But not before I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A child's voice, muffled, screaming, "Help me!" before being silenced. It was then that he appeared. P. Diddy came out of a side entrance of the mansion, surrounded by an entourage of men who looked like shadows, as imposing as he was. But Diddy wasn't what I imagined. He didn't look glamorous or charming. He was cold, calculating. His gaze passed through people as if they were nothing more than objects. He was dressed impeccably, but there was something about his posture, his aura, that made me want to look away. It was as if he carried a weight of pure evil. He stopped near the warehouse, inspecting everything with a meticulous eye, as if every detail needed his approval. Then his eyes turned to me. It was only a second, but it felt like an eternity. I felt like he could see every thought in my mind, every doubt and fear. He didn't smile, he didn't say anything, just looked. And that was enough to make me realize that I was dealing with someone who didn't see limits, who didn't see people, just tools. One of the men in the party approached and handed us 2 black duffel bags. The weight was unmistakable, $500,000 in cash, half the promised payment. My partner took his without hesitation and walked back to the truck. I, on the other hand, hesitated, feeling the weight of not just the money, but what it symbolized. That wasn't payment for a job. It was purchased silence. Before getting back to the truck, I heard Diddy say something to the security guard next to him. "They don't know anything, and it better stay that way." His voice was calm, but it carried a tone of implicit threat that made it clear to me any mistake on my part would cost much more than my life. When I got into the truck, my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to start the engine. The convoy started moving again, leaving that cursed property. But even as the gates closed behind us, I knew I wasn't really leaving. I had crossed a line that night, one from which there was no turning back. The journey back to the starting point was a silent torment. The convoy followed in the same formation, SUVs in front and behind, like a constant shadow, a reminder that we were under surveillance. My partner remained silent, his gaze fixed on the road, but I couldn't shake the sounds I heard in the mansion. The cries, the muffled screams, the desperate words asking for help. All of this echoed in my mind, mixing with Diddy's penetrating gaze, as if he was still watching me, even from miles away. I wanted to ask my partner, confront him about what we had just transported, but every time I looked at him, I saw a man who knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. He wasn't just silent, he was part of the system. Maybe he knew a lot more than I realized, and any questions from me would only put an even bigger target on my back. As the train moved forward, I noticed something curious. We passed through several small towns, but in all of them there seemed to be some presence of Diddy. Billboards with his face, radios that mentioned his name, even luxury cars that seemed to be linked to his influence. It was as if he wasn't just a music mogul, but an omnipresent figure controlling so much more than I could comprehend. When we finally arrived at the meeting point, the early morning silence was broken by the familiar sound of heavy boots on the ground. The security guards appeared again, as efficient as before. There were no words, just gestures for us to hand over the truck and get on the next one. The transition was as cold and mechanical as everything else they did. The new truck was identical to the first, but this time, something inside me changed. Before I even started the return journey, I felt a growing need to understand what was happening. It wasn't just curiosity, it was fear, guilt, and a nagging feeling that I was being used for something monstrous. "Stay in the truck, don't ask questions," my partner murmured, as if reading my thoughts. His voice was low, but there was a severity to it that froze me. He knew I was on edge, and his warning felt less like advice and more like an order. But when my partner went out to inspect the new truck, curiosity took over. The opportunity was there. I quickly got out of the cabin and approached the trailer. My hands shook as I touched the cold metal of the door. Every second, my mind screamed to stop, but the need to know what was inside was unbearable. I was about to open the door when I heard a sound behind me. I quickly turned around and came across one of the security guards. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a small, white envelope. I hesitated, but with shaking hands I opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of photos. Photos of my wife, my children, and my grandchildren, all smiling, living their lives, completely oblivious to the terror that surrounded me. "If you don't follow the rules, they stop smiling," said the security guard with the coldest voice I've ever heard in my entire life. There was no need to scream or threaten anymore. The message was clear, and the weight of it fell on me like a ton. I knew at that moment that it wasn't just my silence that was being bought. It was my soul. I returned to the truck, defeated, my heart heavy with the knowledge that there was something much bigger and darker at play. When the convoy started moving again, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to escape, it was already too late. I wasn't just driving a truck, I was part of a machine that operated in the shadows, a machine run by P. Diddy, who seemed to have the world at his fingertips and a total absence of limits to his cruelty. The second trip took me to an even more remote place, a place that seemed like something out of a nightmare. The destination was a gigantic estate, larger and even more oppressive than the previous mansion. As soon as we passed through the gates, I noticed that this place wasn't just a drop-off place. It was a complex, a veritable empire of control and decay. Armed guards were everywhere, but they were not like the previous ones. These had a predatory look, as if their every movement was a threat. The convoy stopped in front of a main building that looked more like a cathedral of darkness. The exterior was impeccable, but what happened inside, I could only imagine. The boxes began to be unloaded again, but this time I forced myself to look closer. It was impossible to ignore. Despite the guards watching me like hawks, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before: scuff marks on the inside of the trailer doors. They weren't random marks. There were hands, desperate, trying to get out. The sounds coming from the speakers were louder this time, crying, pleading in languages I didn't understand. But they weren't just children's voices. There were teenagers, maybe even adults, begging for mercy. Whatever was happening here, it was something that defied any notion of humanity. When one of the boxes was unloaded, I noticed a small piece of paper that fell out. I picked it up discreetly, with my heart racing. It was a scribbled letter with words in Spanish that I barely understood, but the meaning was clear. "Please help us. We are prisoners." Before I could hide the paper, one of the guards approached, snatching it from my hand. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with an icy stare, a reminder that I had no right to intervene. When the trailers were finally emptied, something new happened. The guards opened a side gate and led the boxes into an area that appeared underground. It was as if the true purpose of this place was hidden beneath the ground. My partner, for the first time, broke his stance of indifference. He whispered something to me as he looked at the gate that closed behind the boxes. They call it the Diddy Club. They say no one comes out the same. My hands felt cold and I felt my stomach drop. "Club Diddy?" I asked without thinking. He gave me a blank look, but with something else, a glimmer of fear. "You don't want to know what happens there, just forget it." To forget? How could anyone forget that? As the gate closed, the muffled voices of despair still echoed. I tried not to think about what was going on in that club, but the idea that Diddy was the mastermind behind it, that he not only allowed but commanded this horror, made me sick. And then he appeared again. Diddy got out of a luxury car that had stopped next to the complex. Dressed impeccably, as always, he was surrounded by his security guards. But something was different this time. He had a smile on his face, cold, cutting, devoid of any trace of empathy. He wasn't just inspecting the operation. He looked satisfied, as if he was looking at a masterpiece he had created. As he passed me, he stopped for a moment. "Good job," he said, his tone almost casual. But his eyes said something else. There was something about them that made me feel like he could see every thought in my head, every attempt to question or resist. And then he added, "Keep it up, and your family will love what you're doing for them." What was supposed to be a compliment sounded more like a veiled threat. I just nodded, unable to say anything. He headed toward the building, disappearing behind the doors, while I stood there, caught between fear and guilt, knowing that with every second I was sinking deeper into an abyss from which I could not escape. Once the delivery was complete, we were instructed to wait while the next payment was arranged. I was leaning against the truck, trying to control my breathing and the flood of thoughts. The estate felt more alive now, but not in a comforting way, more as if every movement there was part of a precise gear of something monstrous. And then, like a slowly approaching storm, P. Diddy emerged again, this time without the rush of his first appearance. He walked with an unsettling confidence, surrounded by security guards who looked like living shadows. His every step seemed to echo in the tense atmosphere, as if he carried with him an invisible power that forced everyone to stay alert. He approached slowly, not straight towards us, but towards one of the security guards guarding the entrance to Club Diddy. He exchanged a few words with the man, but even from a distance, you could see the weight of his presence. It was as if his every move was calculated to intimidate. Then he turned and started walking towards us. My partner stood still, but I couldn't hide my nervousness. My palms were sweating and my heart was racing as Diddy approached. When he finally stopped in front of us, his eyes met mine. There was no emotion there, none. It was like looking into the void, but it was a void that knew too much. "You did what I asked," he said calmly. His voice was low, but it carried a tone that seemed to cut through the air around us. "That's what I like, men who understand their place." I tried to maintain my composure, but I couldn't respond. I just nodded. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me, before continuing. "You know," he began, his voice now lower, almost confidential. "The world is a much bigger place than most people can imagine. You've already seen a piece of it today. There are things that need to be done to maintain order, things that most people wouldn't have the courage to do. That's why there are people like me." He smiled then, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cruel, almost mocking. "And people like you." My partner finally broke the silence. "We're just here for the job, sir." Diddy laughed, a low, sharp laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Everyone says that in the beginning, but in the end, everyone ends up understanding. It's more than just work. It's about knowing what really matters. Family, for example." He emphasized the word family in a way that made me feel a lump in my throat. The memory of the photos they showed me before came back with a vengeance. Diddy knew exactly how to manipulate. He didn't need to raise his voice or make direct threats. He had control because he knew how to attack where it hurt most. Before leaving, he took one more look at me, his eyes sharp like blades. "Remember," he said, his voice thick with intent, "you're not just part of this now. You're on my list, and it's always good to be on my list, as long as you know what it means." He turned and began walking back to the building, his security guards following like loyal shadows. The silence he left behind was deafening, as if his every word was still hanging in the air. I felt like I was trapped in a net that I couldn't escape, and P. Diddy wasn't just a powerful man. He was something much worse. A monster hiding in plain sight, using his fame and influence to operate something so deeply dark that anyone who came near was sucked into an abyss of fear and silence. When the gates to P. Diddy's estate finally closed behind us, I felt a momentary relief, but it was just that, momentary. The convoy took us back to the point of origin, where we were to leave the truck and receive the rest of the payment. During the journey, the silence in the truck was deafening. My partner, who had previously seemed indifferent, now had a harder, almost troubled expression. I wanted to ask him what he knew, what he had already seen, but after what happened, I preferred to remain silent. At that point, the feeling that any word spoken could turn into a death sentence was overwhelming. Arriving at the meeting point, we were greeted by a different team, other security guards, more rigid and even more hostile. They led us to a makeshift room in a nearby warehouse. Inside, on a metal table, were two new black duffel bags. As soon as I saw the money, I felt its weight in a different way. It wasn't just paper. It was the price of my peace, my morals, perhaps even my soul. "Your final payment," one of the security guards said without any emotion. "You're free to go, but remember, you've never been here. You've never seen anything. And most of all, don't ever say anything." My partner took his suitcase without hesitation and left without saying a word. I, however, stood still, looking at the money. My mind was chaos. Every note seemed to scream at me, remembering the muffled cries, the sounds of the trailer, the look in Diddy's eyes, cold, calculating, as if he were untouchable. My hand shook as I picked up the suitcase, and when I finally managed to move, I felt like I was carrying a curse. The way home was long and lonely. Every mile felt like a judgment, a reminder of what I had done and allowed. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I looked out the bright window where my family was gathered, laughing and living their normal lives. That's why I took that job, right? To secure their future. But now, looking at them, all I could feel was shame and fear. I entered the house carrying the suitcase, but I didn't have the courage to open it. I placed it on the kitchen table, the sound echoing in the silence of the night. My wife was asleep, and I was grateful for that. I couldn't explain it, not even lie. I went up to the room and sat on the bed, staring into space. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those little hands clawing at the inside of the trailer, heard the muffled screams, felt Diddy's penetrating gaze, reminding me that I was now part of something terrible. That night, sleep didn't come. Every minute that passed seemed to increase the weight of guilt and paranoia. I knew my life would never be the same. Even with the promise of wealth, with the money there on the table, the truth was that I had crossed a limit from which I could not go back. P. Diddy was not just a famous name. He was the epicenter of an empire of fear, control, and cruelty. And I was now stuck in the middle of it. When the sun finally began to be born, I got out of bed, exhausted and defeated. I looked at the money once again, knowing that no matter how much he bought, it would never be enough to erase what I had seen, or what I had ignored. And the worst of all, I knew that somewhere Diddy was still there, controlling everything, and that he never would let me forget.